Karl Treacher, the Group CEO of the Culture Institute of Australia. Karl's background is in science, marketing, culture and leadership, as well as his research into brand reputation and culture has led to over 60 published articles, as well as speaking engagements at TEDx and the Committee for Economic Development in Australia. There's not much Karl hasn't done, from working with Arnold Schwarzenegger to competing in a variety of endurance sports. He's actually fresh from running the Culture Institute's CultureCon, and that's why he's down in Melbourne. A huge success from all accounts and what I've seen on LinkedIn. It's a leading in-person event driving positive cultural change near and far, and they really have cutting-edge speakers. So please do check out CultureCon if you're in that part of the world. Karl's talk is entitled "The Wonder and the Truth About Toxic Leadership." I'm not going to say any more than that. I'm going to leave that to the man himself. So without further ado, please welcome the guru, that's Karl Treacher, and also a very good friend. And for those that have tuned in over the past 4 years to what was the Inspirathon and now the PeopleFirst Summit. Hello, Karl.
Hello, Matt. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you, as always. I know we go back, I hate to think how long, probably 15 years now.
More.
And I love what you do. I love what you're doing. I've been watching you develop since you were a very young boy, obviously 15 years ago. And I think this is a critical and really important thing that you're doing in elevating culture, inspiring workplaces for everyone at a really important time.
Thank you. Well, without further ado, I'm just going to let you do your thing. I'll speak to you in about half an hour.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. I would just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging here in Melbourne. So I'll be talking today, I don't know how long, but certainly not too long to switch off. I think I'm going to be talking about something that's really relevant to all of us. I am in a hotel room, so I should probably just preface that I'm not in my bedroom. I'm actually on a work assignment for an incredible piece of work, actually, where we're trying to transform the culture of a 38,000 person organisation, and it's very possible. I think that's the key message. So today I am going to be talking about toxic workplaces in particular. The prevalence of toxic workplaces. I'm going to scare you all with statistics and facts about how prevalent toxic workplaces are and also how they come about. I'm not going to leave us there. I'm going to take us to a position where we set the scene and we actually face into the reality of toxic workplaces. Before we start talking about the remedy, what is it that we can actually do? And through our research at the Culture Institute and by lots of insights globally at the moment to arrest this situation, we're finding nuggets, things that aren't overwhelming. We don't need to transform entire mindsets and mentality to achieve this. We actually can hone in on specific leadership traits that are perpetuating toxic culture. And so if we arrest those and we identify different types of leaders, we invest in different types of cultural leadership, we have an opportunity to reset that and to ensure that we're not creating environments that are conducive to toxicity. I should probably also state, in Australia, we have a new set of laws around occupational health and safety, or workplace health and safety. So it's now not okay for organisations to just respond to a complaint of harassment, for instance, or sexual harassment. We have to make sure that we are taking positive duty and proactive steps to ensure that we're creating environments that eliminate the opportunity for harassment. Now, that is an absolute reset. And in my language, that is culture has teeth. For the first time in 20 years, no longer am I standing up on stage or with a client or online waving my hands around saying, hey, listen, let's do better. Let's be better. Let's be better for one another. It's now law. So hopefully that I'll still appeal to those people that have the right sort of mindset and positive intent. But the reality is it's now law. So there's no other way to be. Let me start by asking you a question, or to ask you to reflect how important it is for you to feel truly heard. And I think that's obviously a question that we hear in our relationships, obviously with our partner. But in the workplace, how important do you feel it is to be heard? An interesting insight from Gallup very recently indicated that only 21% of employees feel that they are heard at work. which means the overwhelming amount or volume of employees believe that they're not. And when we're not heard, we don't feel respected. And the one element of a healthy, high-performing culture is respect. So if we're not feeling heard or seen or recognized or acknowledged, we're not feeling respected. And when we don't feel respected, we don't really contribute. And so then we start getting into the traditional type of metrics around employee engagement goes down. We don't get to collaborate. We're not going to innovate. We're not going to expend discretionary effort because we don't feel valued. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'll talk about how toxic culture presents and what creates that. But I'll also talk about the remedy, and in particular, curiosity. And the way that curiosity can then arrest and pour water on the fire that is toxic culture. But first, let me give you some interesting statistics about toxic culture itself. So 76% of employees have experienced or witnessed toxic culture. Now, we've just run a study with 257 companies here in Australia that indicated that 75% of employees have been in a toxic workplace environment in the last 5 years. So for me, it's a little bit difficult to even comprehend those numbers, particularly because a lot of the time on LinkedIn and the conversation is about how great workplaces are. It's great to work here. It's terrific. We've got a really positive work environment. Leaders like to say that. But our insights suggest that's not true. Our insights suggest that there's a hell of a lot of work to be done. And yes, there's going to be shining lights and there are going to be great workplaces. And I think there's a lot to be learned from those. And we don't need to reinvent things if we can see what works. So yes, they should be recognized and heralded through legitimate bona fide awards, much like Matt does. But I do state very clearly that the vast majority of employees aren't having the optimal workplace experience. And so in that 75% of employees that indicate that they are being in a toxic work environment, they attribute the catalyst or the cause of that to leadership, and in particular, senior leadership. And what's more concerning is that 79% of that 75% is an aggregate, obviously, but 79% of women have been in a toxic work environment in Australia in the last 5 years, which means we're getting it wrong. Culturally, we're getting it wrong somewhere. Now, as a people scientist, I want to know why. I want to know why as a people scientist academically, but more importantly, I've got an 11-year-old daughter who's going to be in the workplace in 10 years' time. And the last thing I want, after investing a decade into her emotional well-being, is to put her at the hands of a toxic leader. I think that should be really motivating for all of us. Anyone that has children or that cares about anyone at all, our friends, for instance, or our family. What happens is you enter a toxic work environment, you get contaminated by that to some extent, and you take that home with you. And you are not your best with your family. Your empathy, your relational health is compromised. And because of that, your family's relational health is compromised. And then that is a knock-on effect. And I'll talk about some more seismic insights that we've got around degrees of empathy and mind blindness in a minute. But that's what we're finding, is that through a ripple effect, social transmission, along with the vast implications coming from technology, we're finding that empathy is in decline. And because of that, we're caring less. And at a time where we're in a US election where who knows what's going to happen there, it's a time to care, not care less. Some other statistics that are going to shock you. 58% of employees have left jobs specifically due to their toxic workplace in the last 2 years. And toxicity in Australia costs businesses $22 billion in turnover over 5 years, which is, for us, that's an enormous number. It's 10 times that number for the US, so $230 billion over 5 years. Common manifestations. So what does this look like? When we talk about toxic culture, I ran a workshop yesterday with 100 people and I asked the question, have you been in a toxic workplace? What does it look like for you? Outside of that anecdotal evidence, and it's all very similar, the reality is toxic culture, by definition, is a systemic negative behaviors. So negative behaviors that are more dominant and prevalent than positive behaviors. Now, what we know about high-performing culture is it starts with psychological safety and positive effect or positive feeling, vibe, mood, climate. So if we're in a situation where we have a systemic negative effect, we have a toxic culture, which is it lays the foundation and environment for poor behaviour. In Australia last Thursday at 3 o'clock, the largest media network, Nine, released their independent review into their culture, and they found that over 50% of people were living in a toxic environment in that particular company. When we got down to when the report identifies what the causes were and what that looks like, and it was a blame culture. It was people waking up in the morning feeling sick because they knew they were going to be blamed for something, or white-anted, or in conflict for something that wasn't necessarily their fault. The common element philosophically is that it's putting individual benefit / greed, myopic self-interest ahead of the interests of others in the company, and that's what causes toxic culture. Which means we put people into a leadership position that care more about themselves than other people. Now, the issue with that, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, possibly, because let's face it, this could go forever. The things that got leaders to their position of leadership is personal achievement. And so some of the very behaviors that have led to their personal success are the things that they need to put out for the collective success. So competitive behavior, overly striving, focusing on results at all cost. If we're trying to create and foster a culture of collaboration and innovation and curiosity and empathy and customer centricity and things that actually lead to great performance, we need to put ourselves aside and become the coach. Need to go from being the star player to the coach, where our success is everyone's success. I think some of the other obvious ways to recognize that you're in a toxic environment is micromanagement and control. So very recently I was working with a company, and look, there's nothing wrong with the leader. They weren't a terrible person. And obviously when we say toxic, people think of psychopaths. And let's face it, 1 in 24 leaders in Australia are compromised in terms of their mirror neurons and the ability to recognize someone else's experience. So yes, sociopaths at least. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we just have leaders that are deeply insecure. Now, deeply insecure individuals, and let's face it, anxiety is through the roof globally, particularly in the Western world. What that means is we seek to control. So if we're insecure, we look to control our environment. Deeply insecure people shouldn't be leaders. I think that's really important to understand. In terms of recognizing senior leaders, if you go to any of the executive search firms, they're going to look at experience, capability, they're going to look at expertise and your qualifications. They might do an emotional intelligence test, and I really hope they do. If they find that you are a deeply insecure individual, you do not get a seat at the table in terms of leadership, because the first thing you're going to do is seek to control your environment. And what that means is you're going to seek to control other people, which is the root cause. But let's wind it back a little bit. Let's wind it back into, what does this look like? Why would you even think that you can control someone else? The reality is the recognition of one another. So there's a concept, Sacha Baron Cohen, Borat, was the comedian. His brother is a famous scientist professor in the States. He's Simon Baron Cohen. And he coined the concept of theory of mind, which is a neurobiological concept essentially where we have mirror neurons or von Economo neurons where we can recognize someone else's existence and we can sense and feel what's happening for them. So we translate that into empathy. And empathy is a lovely term that I like to talk about in organizational psychology. We talk about in actual fact and reality, it's a difficult concept for people to get their head around. However, what we're finding societally is, and Obama actually made a good point of this many years ago, to say we've got an empathy deficit. Empathy's in decline. That came out of a study in the States that indicated that between 1979 and 2009, there's a 49% decrease in empathy for college students, who, by the way, are now leaders. So their actual ability to recognize one another, see one another, help someone feel seen and empathize is compromised. Now, that's just not that generation, that's specific to that generation because technology has interfered largely with their lives, and they have 1/3 relational health experience than a Gen X. Now, it doesn't mean Gen Xers are right either, because we're coming off a neurotic plague. So our parents were generally very nervous, anxious people that transferred that into our generation. But what you do find is because of that technology, the relational health and the way that they talk, if you talk to a vast, in our focus groups, when we talk to a lot of millennials, they haven't had the experience to develop the empathetic pathways, and empathy grows through experience. It doesn't happen in isolation. So very commonly, and even this week, I've spoken to two people, 20 and 21-year-olds have bumped into, asked them a series of questions. They don't ask questions. They talk about themselves. They don't demonstrate an interest in anyone else. They don't have their very low levels of curiosity. Now, these aren't gross generalizations for the whole demographic, but this is very prevalent in that demographic. So it's important to be aware. It doesn't mean that they are sociopaths or psychopaths and don't have the actual neurobiology themselves. It just means they need to do work. Let me get back to this. So what does it look like? Toxic workplace looks like a lack of psychological safety, a lack of the ability to feel like you've been given the benefit of the doubt, and that you can ask questions, or that you can make mistakes or ask for help. Now, asking questions, making mistakes, and asking for help, they are hallmarks of high-performing organizations. We see that. Everyone knows that. The Google Aristotle project was very clear about that. Organizations like Pixar, Navy SEALs, Netflix to some extent, although I've got some concerns there, have operationalized ways to do this. So providing feedback, there's a company here just down the street from where I'm in Melbourne that has a concept called a rumble. If you have a disagreement, it's accepted, it's encouraged, you go into a room together and you rumble it out. There's no hard feelings, there's no passive aggression, there's no conversation after the conversation. It's just a way to hash out differences of opinion in a safe environment. That is what's required. That does not happen in a toxic environment. So what happens there is silent disagreement, essentially, and passive aggression. So the other key point out of everything I say today is that if culture is left alone, if you do nothing, humans default to tribal behavior. We form tribes. We form alliances. What do tribes do? Tribes go to war. Tribes and clans go to war. So if you leave a culture to its own devices, it's very rare for it to come together and find a proactive, pro-social, generalized, harmonized, cohesive cause that we all rally behind and are excited about and look after. We form fiefdoms. We form clans. We form tribes. We feel secure. We feel cues of belonging and a sense of belonging in our tribe, and then we defend it. And we defend that tribe against another tribe. And immediately we start to develop a toxic environment. And then we become compromised. Then people leave and a variety of things happen, and it escalates to a point where you're possibly out of control and you're possibly in the headlines like we saw last week with Australia's leading largest media network, where it becomes more normal than not to have a toxic workplace. The impact of toxic workplaces: 50% higher turnover rates, 33% lower productivity, 48% of employees deliberately decrease their work effort in toxic workplaces, and 85% say that toxic workplaces affect their home life. To my earlier point, we cannot afford, in the world that we live in, to be wandering back into our environments with our children and family and not be in a positive frame of mind, or at least a neutral frame of mind. And the reality is, it's not up to you. It's very, very difficult for you psychologically to wander out of a toxic environment where you've been white-anted, you've been in conflict, you've been blamed for things, you've had to defend yourself, you've gone to war, to come in, neutralize, and provide a great role model for your family or your children. I think in this day and age, that's probably the most important thing. Let's forget about shareholder return and being productive at work. We actually need to ensure that we're creating a positive, empathetic existence for our family and our children. So this is the stuff that gets me out of bed, and that is, how do we ensure that we provide we advance society? There's an interesting book by David Gillespie who wrote a variety of things. He wrote Sweet Poison, I think, which was the sugar book. Great book. He's an excellent journalist. He wrote a book recently called Toxic at Work. Now, it's not my favorite book. It's not my least favorite book either. But he focuses on psychopaths and the prevalence of sociopathy and psychopathy in work. And it's real. It's quite interesting and it's quite real. Out of everything he wrote, the main message there is, if that's the case, get away from it. So you can't fix it. This isn't something where we can say, oh, look, yeah, you've got to develop your empathy and you should be asking more questions, being more curious and interested and contemplative. If they don't have the biology, the neurobiology to be that way, they're never going to get it. So your job is to stay away and remove yourself from that environment. Let me look just quickly about why toxic workplaces happen. I have talked a little bit about the deep insecurities that lead to controlling environments, and that's usually the case. There's another really fascinating thing that happens, and that is you can trace toxic workplaces back to leadership behavior, and it's something between 55 and 60%. There's an interesting study from Harvard that came out talking about that. 71% of toxic leaders, now toxic leaders are those leaders that are compromised in terms of their ability to care, essentially. 71% demonstrate narcissistic tendencies. Now, it doesn't mean that they're a narcissist or antisocial personality disorder like Donald Trump. They just demonstrate narcissistic tendencies, which are encouraged by their role. So, better leaders, there's a couple of typical profiling tools that everyone uses. Hogan's one of them. Altruism has to be in a leadership profile. So if you find that you're looking for a leader and you ask these questions, altruism, empathy, high sense of curiosity and care, contemplative behavior, if they're absent, that person is not a leader. They might be the most gifted intellect that you've ever run into. They might be the most accomplished in terms of their education, but their relational health and their ability to carry people forward culturally is incredibly compromised, and they will never do it. So the default setting I mentioned before around culture is to move to a tribal position. Why is that? Wouldn't you think that we'd know about that? Well, we don't know about that because we don't know about culture. Certainly in Australia, there's not one subject in an MBA course, in a master's course. There's no course, there's no syllabus inside any HR or leadership program that talks about culture. So why would we expect it to be any better? If our natural human default is for us to be tribal and conflict-ridden and go to war, that's always going to prevail. We don't have any sort of circuit breaker. There's nothing there that suggests that we can interfere with that taking place. And of course, that will take place, and it is. All the research suggests that. Previously, I mentioned Sacha Baron Cohen's brother Simon, talking about the theory of mind, which is we can relate to someone else's perspective. Walking in their shoes is more the simplified version of that. The concept of when that's not the case, we end up in a position where you have what they call mind blindness. So look, there's probably another good concept to talk about here, which is called sonder, a concept that entered the dictionary in 2014, which means you can see people as the lead actor in their movie, not just the extra in yours. And to be mind blind means we just see people as extras. Now, the volume of mind blindness is increasing all the time because empathy is decreasing. So we don't care as much. We care more about ourselves. Instagram technology is certainly encouraging that and perpetuating that. This week we had Johan Hari talk at our conference about stolen focus and the implications of that. And yes, it's obvious that your partner might be stuck or addicted to their phone, but what's actually happening is they're decreasing their degree of interest and empathy for you. And so that has to be arrested. 40% of executives struggle with mind blindness, their ability to connect or even recognize that other people have an existence. 62% of toxic leaders show low scores on empathy. 78% rate themselves above average. And this is the critical point. People overestimate and over-index their self-awareness. And another study indicates that 85% of the leaders believe that they are very self-aware. They are very capable of understanding another perspective. And in the same study, through another series of measures, we found that 15% were actually self-aware. So because of that overestimation, and I think even 85% is low, in other studies, all toxic leaders believe they're not toxic because they don't recognize the implications of their behavior. And so that the opportunity to hold a mirror up hasn't been afforded to them. So they don't know. And they believe that they're not toxic. And that's 100% of leaders. 100% of toxic leaders. The root cause, I've mentioned the deep sense of insecurity, need for constant validation, control, their inability to make mistakes. You'll always find evidence of a toxic leader because they won't say sorry. I presented at a conference yesterday and I called someone the wrong name, and the first thing I did was to go and apologise. It's a mistake, but when we make mistakes, it's very reasonable to own it. And I think it's important that we do. Narcissistic tendencies, so self-focus on decision making. We don't involve others in our decision making. We certainly don't attribute credit where it's due. We did a very, very large, it was a $1 billion project here where we were designing an environment or an experience across Australia. We spent maybe 3 years doing it, and I was heavily involved in that. And the leader at the time, well, my client, not once recognised our work and claimed it all as themselves. And they don't even know they're doing it. It's just naturally part of the toxic process that they're in. I do want to talk about power intoxication because this is fascinating. It's an emerging area. Before I get to how we can fix this, because I know I've painted a pretty bleak picture. The science behind power intoxication or corruption, or hubris syndrome as they call it, the neural pathways that we have, and I know I've talked a little bit about neurobiology and mirror neurons, but the pathways that we have can easily get compromised when we become a leader. So there's a statistic here, I just want to pull this up here. Leaders experiencing power intoxication show a 45% decrease in the mirror neuron activity. So they become compromised by half in their ability to recognize, see, and care. So those cells that are responsible for empathy, and this is a study that came out of the Natural Neuroscience Journal in 2022, 45% decrease in that. So what does that look like? Decreased empathy, I've mentioned that. So 67% decreased ability to read others' emotions. They can't recognize suffering or discomfort. So in a world where we find that anxiety is rife and people are struggling for a variety of reasons, there's a lot of pressure on. Burnout in Australia is extremely high. We need leaders to be able to recognize that that's happening and address it. We need them to be able to wander in, provide reassurance, and make the right decisions for that individual at that time. Other indications of this toxicity is overconfidence. So the dismissal of expert advice. You'll see them making their own decisions. Even culture. I've mentioned there's no cultural education program in Australia. You have to rely on people like myself and my colleagues and other organisations like us that dedicate our lives to understanding how to arrest toxic culture and build healthy, high-performing culture. You have to rely on that because you clearly don't know how to do it yourself. 75% of employees live in a toxic environment. So if you're left to your own devices, it ain't working. So I think there's a couple of other things I should probably pull out before I start, give us a little bit of hope. I might just go to hope because I think I'm running out of time, and I'll paint that picture all day. The reality is that we can fix this. So for a long time, we talked about empathy and care as being the remedy. But the problem with that is empathy is really difficult. It's difficult to say to someone, care more. It's difficult to say, you're not caring enough. We need you to start investing more in understanding one another and demonstrating care. It's really hard for us to do. And so what we find is we default to a variety of mechanisms because the overt process doesn't necessarily work. We go to things like mindfulness training, where we teach people to meditate, be more considerate, be present. Now, that really does work. But what works even better, and this is really, really recent insights that have come out in the last 18 months, by triggering curiosity in individuals and leaders, the knock-on effect or the byproduct is that we increase empathy, more so than even mindfulness training. I found that astounding because I would have thought dedicated, specific training towards being more mindful and considerate would have a greater effect. It doesn't. What has a greater effect is teaching people to ask questions and be legitimately interested and present in the answer. What happens through curiosity is that we start caring about the other person's existence. One of the best things any leader can do is say, tell me about you. And outside of work, what are you doing? Look, that's important. Some good questions there are, what are you working on? How can I help? That's a great question. However, tell me about you. Gets to a sense of belonging and a sense of connectivity between people that actually carries on to bring empathy to life. So it creates psychological safety there's a sense of empathy that builds just through understanding one another from a cognitive perspective. It reduces defensive responses, so we don't go into if we feel like we're seen, and the first question I asked you is how often and how well do you feel like you're heard? If we get to a point where we feel heard and people are interested in us, we don't get to a defensive, protective position, which is very tribal. We encourage multiple perspectives and can take multiple perspectives on board. We don't just fortify our own perspective. So I might just get to a point here of building a curiosity-based culture. So asking questions around why is the start. And look, I'm no big fan of Simon Sinek. I think I openly suggest that. I think it was an interesting concept to say why. I haven't seen him do anything that's useful outside of that. We were asking that question in terms of why a decade before this. So I find a correlation between the leaders that say Simon Sinek's terrific and their actual performance to be substandard. So Captain Obvious or real leaders don't subscribe to that is probably where I sit. But after that little rant and possible personal attack, I do think that the concept of why is critical. And those people, the more people that say that, including Simon, the better. So as a leader, we need to be understanding how are you going. Don't just leave it at that. Good, thanks. Why? What's happening for you? Oh, look, I'm struggling. I'm actually struggling. I just said good, thanks. Well, what are you struggling with? Why is that the case? How can I help? So that practicing assertive listening is really important. Institutionally or operationally with larger organizations that do this well, the globe knows about Google's 20% innovation time and curiosity space. Personally, I don't think that's, I don't even know that's true. I think Google, maybe they started with that. And it was a really good way to start with innovation. Hack days are the same. Some hack days have been great, but over time they might interfere more than actually deliver. But creating an environment and a key cultural symbol that we do value curiosity and we encourage people to be curious in that time is critical. Microsoft's growth mindset is another thing. Adobe's Kickbox. These things actually lead to great innovation for the company because you're almost forcing people to be curious and collaborative with one another. And because of that, we get the wisdom of crowds. We get the collective mindset solving problems, which is, essentially a superpower for humanity. And I think that's another key point when we talk about culture. And this talk isn't about the definition of culture, and maybe it should be. Culture is for a very long time been seen as a line item in HR. It's been employee engagement is about productivity, and culture is actually about alignment to strategy. So what I'm really keen to do is make sure that we see culture for what it is, which is humankind's superpower. And our ability to come together and solve complex problems sets us aside from any other species. So when we get that right, in a healthy environment where we encourage different perspectives in a very diverse and inclusive perspectives, it's an incredible superpower. It puts us in a position to be able to solve amazing problems for the world. So what happens if we get this right? Now, let me paint the good picture. I'm going to finish with what this looks like in the positive sense. Curious organizations are organizations that have invested in being more curious and encouraging their leaders to be more curious, which we know is the antithesis of control and toxicity. They garner 55% greater levels of trust. Now, the thing with trust, as we know, is it arrives on foot and leaves on horseback, which is that old famous quote. It's exactly the case. We spend forever establishing trust, but it can go immediately. And when I say go immediately, if you employ the wrong leader, that will can undermine decades of trust. We see that particularly if we're talking about CEOs that move into a role and that haven't been vetted in terms of their ability to connect. There's 41% improvement in employee engagement for curious organizations. 38% have much better collaboration scores, of course, because they're curious. There's 49% or 47 to 9% greater innovation metrics. So they explore more because, let's face it, curiosity leads to exploration. And 31% reduction in workplace conflict. Now, workplace conflict doesn't have to be overt. What we found is that when we say workplace conflict, you sort of get into IR, industrial relations, how many disputes have we had, how many law cases are live. It doesn't need to be that. It can actually be, am I stonewalling the person that I work with? And because that is a conflict, we are not actually connecting on things that benefit others in the organization and the organization itself. So I'd like to sort of leave with a couple of things. One is just daily practices. So asking 3 questions in meetings. One of my friends is a former world champion professional athlete. He's a lovely guy. However, he had to train himself to ask questions. So after being, in the spotlight for so long and a household name here in Australia, he got to a point where he got enough feedback, and because he's an athlete, he's used to getting feedback, where to suggest that he was not conducive or not connecting with others. So he had to train himself to ask questions. And be it him or anyone else in our world, asking questions and being curious isn't actually where we start anymore. There's so much information coming to us, and we're sharing so much information that asking questions and being curious is being lost and slipped through the gaps. So the scheduling curiosity coffee chats is something that I recommend, where you're just having a coffee to understand someone. Tell me more about you. I'd like to learn more about you. What are you doing? Why is that? How does that work? Just as my wife returns to our hotel room. And keeping a learning journal.
That's amazing.
Thanks. My wife entering the room.
I just want to say, that's amazing to see Danny as well. So anyway, about 1 more minute, Karl.
Great. I'll go to the crux of it, which is I'd encourage everyone, be it a leader or anyone in any organization, to really do 3 things. The first one is stop. And the statistics are overwhelming that our attention span has gone from 12 seconds to 8 seconds in the last 15 years as humans through technology. So a goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds. I think it's really important that we stop to start with. Sonder is the second point, that we recognize each other as lead actors in their movie, not just extras in ours. And we become very curious and interested in one another, because I think the future of mankind depends on that.
Thank you so much. And what a real moment there at the end, with your wife entering the room as well. So so much to go into there. I think we want to be moving on. We've got a 24-hour schedule, but one of my favorite facts is our peak curiosity as human beings is at 5 years old, and it diminishes from there onwards. Hence where you have sons, daughters, nieces, nephews always asking why. That's their peak curiosity, and then we just go off the cliff. So and there's a great book out there called Rebel Talent by Francesca Gino from Harvard Business School, talking around why it pays to break the rules in work and life, and that's just all curiosity. It's always been done this way is a really bad saying, isn't it? Why? How can we do it better? So I thought your talk, as always, was absolutely fantastic. Adding to your other examples like Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard at one point had growth through diversity of thinking. So celebrating the differences of people and their backgrounds, and therefore the different ideas they'd bring to the table. So I just want to add that one to the mix too. But Karl, absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm really looking forward to promoting this on demand, if people aren't watching this on demand, because I think that you get a hell of a lot of learning from it. So thank you so much, sir.
No, thanks, Matt. I really appreciate being part of it. I love what you do. Good on you.
Likewise. Take care. See you soon.
Cheers.